Hello. In this video I'd like to talk about a pretty obscure British film from the 1930s, so it fits quite neatly into my category. It is pretty obscure, although again it's one of these films that probably film buffs would know about, and I think it's got an entry on Wikipedia, so it can't be totally obscure. But anyway, it's a very interesting film from 1935, and it's called The Passing of the Third Floor Back. Now, that title needs a bit of an explanation. Interesting enough, by the way, it's based on a story. I only realised this when I looked at the film again the other day. It's based on a story by Jerome K. Jerome, who was a well-known Edwardian writer who wrote Three Men in a Boat. It's quite a well-known comic novel about three men and a dog going down the River Thames in a rowing boat and having adventures. And actually 2 or 3 film and TV versions of that have been made. But I didn't know that he wrote this story, and this story is completely different. It's not a comedy at all. And it's, to explain the title, this is one of the things that interests me about all British films, is that they're glimpses of a Britain that is largely disappeared today. And the third floor back part of it means the third floor back room in a shared house, a lodging house. This was absolutely standard in London in those days. Basically, people lived... there weren't anything like the number of modern apartments and flats and new houses and so on that there are now. And this was before the Second World War, so a lot of what was destroyed by bombing later was still there. And a lot of people lived in basically shared houses, in rented rooms, either single rooms or suites of rooms, in lodging houses. And then there would be a landlady, and everybody would actually come down in the morning and have breakfast together. So it was in some ways like a kind of communal form of living. But these houses were not really adapted. They weren't flats or apartments in the modern sense. They weren't really adapted for communal living. They were big old houses that would have been lived in by rich families with lots of servants and things like that. But they were divided up into sections where people lived. And in those days, and actually well up to even the 1960s, you could very easily find cheap rented accommodation, even in London, which is definitely not the case today. But a lot more people lived in rented accommodation. There wasn't anything like this amount of home ownership there is now, and this aspiration for everybody to own their own home in those days didn't apply to you unless you were pretty rich, or unless you saved for years and years and years. So the third floor back is the third floor back room, very poky little attic in a lodging house. And this is just one of hundreds of thousands of similar houses in London at that time. And the film starts with this rather nice opening where you have a shot over the rooftops of London in the summer, and then it sort of says something like, it refers to all the hundreds of thousands of lives that are going on in these houses. Behind the walls of the house, behind the scenes, there are millions of people, each with their own hopes and fears and desires, and their own secrets and their own problems and their own lives going on. And most of the time we're not aware of them, because most of it's going on, within 4 walls. And particularly in those days, well, probably still now, but particularly in those days in Britain, people did tend to keep themselves to themselves quite a lot, and they didn't want people talking about their private affairs and so on. It was a very reserved kind of society in some ways, although in other ways it was also perhaps friendlier and more communal, as you can see from this film. So anyway, the story features, the film features a very well-known actor, Conrad Veidt. He's the outstanding figure in it, and he's really what makes the film. Conrad Veidt's a very interesting example of, there were a number of émigré German film actors, musicians and so on in Britain in those days. Some of them were Jewish, who had to flee from the Nazis, some of them not, but several of them became very major figures in Britain. Conrad Veidt's an example. He was a very big film star in Britain in the 1930s and 40s. And another one will be Richard Taube, the tenor singer. He was extremely popular in Britain. And also Anton Walbrook, another film actor who acted in more than one Powell and Pressburger's films, was a very big star. So Conrad Veidt is the main star. But what's interesting about the film is that I think it's actually one of the outstanding British films in the 1930s in its way. It's not a great film, and it's not great art or anything like that, but it's a very, very fascinating story. It's well filmed. It's not anything spectacular. It's well filmed, and it's well acted. Most of the actors in it, they all have small parts for the most part, act their part very well, and it does really have the feeling of giving you a glimpse of British life, London life in the 1930s, and it evokes a whole atmosphere in a period which is long gone very well. But what makes it really outstanding is that it starts off basically what the film's about is going into one of these lodging houses, and then you get to meet all the different people living in this house. They're all very different. They've all got their own problems, their own hopes, their own desires, their own frustrations, etc. And you find out about them, and you see how they interact and so on. But it starts off, it sounds a bit like a kind of social documentary, and it does start off as though it's going to be that. But then it turns into something very different. It turns into a kind of metaphysical drama, really, is the only way you could describe it. And that's what makes it really fascinating. And it's quite unexpected. If you don't know the film, you might be quite surprised as to what happens in the film. Anyway, so basically, the house has a number of different characters living in it. For example, there's an elderly to middle-aged to elderly couple. One of the husband is a retired major or colonel from the army, and they're having very bad times financially. And they've got a young daughter, and they're trying to encourage her to marry, or at least at first to become engaged to, and to marry this rich man who lives in the best rooms in the house, who's basically a slum landlord. He's made his money by renting out lots of houses in the East End and so on to poor people, and raking in rents and so on. And he's a thoroughly unpleasant person. He's a self-made man, but a very, very unpleasant and obviously pretty sort of devious and shady character. But they are effectively, virtually selling off their daughter to this man in order to get out of their financial problems. And she doesn't want to marry him, really. I mean, she's in love with a young man of her own choice, but she feels that she's got to marry this older, rich man in order to save her parents. So that's one little tragedy that's going on, one little drama. Then there's a young man who works in a music shop, a record shop, selling records, mostly sort of pop records of the time, dance band music and so on. And he affects this kind of very jaunty kind of seen it all before kind of attitude, but secretly he's actually a rather good musician. He plays the piano very well, and he really aspires to be a classical musician, but he feels that he's not appreciated, and so he has a kind of cynical attitude to it. He doesn't let on very often, just occasionally, to his aspirations for classical music. Then there's another fascinating character. There's a youngish woman. She herself describes herself as the wrong age of 30, who basically lives on her own. She's never married, and she's in danger of becoming what used to be known as an old maid, and she's obviously terrified of this happening. But she basically she tries to keep up appearances, and she wears an awful lot of makeup and powder, and she has this kind of affected, sort of very hard, cynical, modern view of life, as they put it in the film. And she sort of she's very sarcastic and catty, and laughs at everybody and pretends that she doesn't care about anything. Because underneath, she is very lonely, and she is very worried that she's just going to end up on her own for the rest of her life. And then another character in the household is a hilarious woman called Mrs. Dooley, or Mrs. Dooley as they call her behind her back. And she's an Irish lady, and she has pretensions to being rather upper class. She claims to be related to various members of the aristocracy and so on. And you get the impression it probably isn't true, but she's putting on a show, and she dresses in a rather kind of a rich kind of way, and she puts on a show all the time and refers to her titled relations. basically, again, to disguise the fact that she's a rather lonely old woman and she's probably rather down on her luck and financially in problems. Then there's the house, the landlady of the house, and she's very worried. She's in financial straits and her tenants aren't paying the rent regularly, and she's wondering how she can keep things going. So she's rather hard as well. And then there's a cook, and then right at the bottom of the pyramid there's a what would have been called a maid of all work, a servant, a young girl called Stasia, who is basically, she's come from what some they unkindly call a home for reformed girls or something like that, but it's actually some kind of orphanage or something. So she's been kind of given a job almost as a favour, and they keep reminding her of it. She's worked half to death, and people are very unkind to her. But the attitude is, well, she should be grateful for what she gets, considering where she comes from, etc., etc. And she's right at the bottom of the heap. She has a very bad time. Anyway, and there are one or two other characters, but they're the main characters in the house. And there's the rich slum landlord as well. And basically, Stasia is working in the kitchen, and she's got this huge pile of washing up, and she's really depressed. She never gets out of the house. She hasn't got any kind of a life, and she's almost in despair. But she's got this little plant with a flower that she found somewhere. She said that nobody wanted, and she rescued it and looked after it. And that's her little pride and joy. And she's watering the plant. Then she gets into trouble for watering the plant instead of doing the washing up and so on. And then she's put the pot inside a vase belonging to the landlady. The landlady comes to the kitchen and gets really annoyed, and she grabs the vase. The flower falls out, and it's broken. The plant is broken, and she's absolutely devastated because this is the one little thing she's got in her life to make it a bit brighter. And she rushes off and says she's going to just run away, and she can't stand it anymore. As she rushes to the front door, she opens the front door, the bell rings actually, as she's about to rush out. She opens the door, and lo and behold, there is Conrad Veidt, this mysterious stranger. He's just called the Stranger in the film. And he immediately has a remarkable effect on her. He's very kind to her and polite, and actually shows that he actually is interested in her existence at all. And from that moment you realise he's actually come to apply for the room. He's seen room to let, and he's applied for the third floor back. And at first the landlady thinks he's far too sort of grand to want to have a room like that, but in the end he persuades her, and he even pays her in advance, which is a great shock to her. He's also very polite and gentlemanly to her, and he moves in, and effectively the Conrad Veidt character, the Stranger, has this effect on the whole household, and he shows an interest in all of them. He talks to them, he's interested in their problems and their hopes and their dreams and so on, and he gradually affects a transformation in the house. Before that they've all been locked up in their own little worlds, and they've been quite unkind and cynical to one another, and he begins to bring out the good side of everybody in the house and change the whole atmosphere in the house in quite a remarkable way. Anyway, I won't go into too much detail, but that's the essence of the plot. This mysterious stranger has this effect, and it gradually turns into a drama. There's a marvellous section, which is one of my favourite bits, where there's a bank holiday, and it's a marvellous evocation of a bank holiday in 1930s Britain, and Conrad Veidt invites everybody in the house, including even Stasia, the servant, to go down the river on a steamer, go down the river and round the coast of Margate. In those days there were these steamers that went from Tower Pier, called the Eagle steamers, and they used to be very, very popular. And in fact it's very it's very nostalgic for me, that part of the film, because obviously I'm not quite as old enough to have been around in the 1930s, but even when I was a kid they were still running the Eagle steamers, and I did actually go on one or two trips, I think even to Margate. So it's very nostalgic to see. I mean, the one I went on wasn't actually a paddle steamer like the one in the film. It was a bit more modern than that. But I mean, they still went on into my childhood, but they've long gone now. Anyway, that's a marvellous section. And what happens is, it's all the steamer's absolutely packed with people. And in the excitement, Stasia, I mean, it's just the greatest day of her life. She's never done anything like this before, and she's terribly excited. There's a speedboat race, and she hangs over the side, and she falls in. This is way down the river, almost in the sea, so it's extremely dangerous. And then everybody's shouting, and nobody knows what to do. And then Miss whatever her name is, I can't quite remember her name, the old maid, or young lady that thinks she's going to be an old maid, she becomes the great heroine. She leaps in and rescues Stasia. She's a strong swimmer. She rescues Stasia and brings her back. And when she comes back on board, of course, she's the hero of the hour, and everybody cheers, and she's incredibly popular. And for the first time for ages, she feels that people actually appreciate her and actually care about her. And then there's a marvellous bit where she's kind of recovered, and the young music salesman is actually very taken with what she's done, and she's all bedraggled and so on. She goes on to put on her makeup, and he says, "No, don't do that. You look marvellous without it." And she has this wonderful expression on her face. A man has actually said that he thinks she looks marvellous, and a kind of romance starts between them. Anyway, on that day, everybody has a really good time. Everybody ends up being really friendly and happy, and it's, everybody is reconciled to one another, and it looks as though everything's going to be marvellous. But of course, it doesn't quite work out like that. And in the evening, there's a curious conversation between Conrad Veidt and the rich landlord guy. And this is where it starts getting quite strange and metaphysical, because you start realising Conrad Veidt isn't just any old person. He's a stranger, but he's a visitor from somewhere else. And at the very least, he's probably an angel. And later on, in fact, there are even sort of suggestions that he takes on a kind of Christ-like quality. And the slum landlord, it's not so clear with him, but when he has this discussion with Conrad Veidt, he kind of says things that show that he knows what's going on and what Conrad Veidt's trying to do. And you get the impression that he's almost a kind of demonic figure. So it's like a conversation between an angel and a demon. And they are fighting, if you like, for the souls of the people in this house. It's a fascinating idea. Anyway, he says, well, the landlord says, well, okay, you've won today. They're all happy and being nice to one another. But you just wait till tomorrow morning when they have to go back to ordinary life. And of course, he's right. The next day, everybody has to go to work. They're in a hurry to get to the bathroom. Everybody gets irritated. It goes back to normal, and people start being horrible to one another. And it looks as though all is lost. Anyway, without giving the whole thing away, it ends in a great drama. The parents of the young lady decide they're not going to sell her to the landlord, and in the end, the landlord is going to expose them and ruin them. They're going to be out on the streets and so on. And without giving too much away, actually, the rich slum landlord figure ends up dying, but in mysterious circumstances. And it's suspected at first that the major... No, sorry, I can't... No, I've got getting this the wrong way around. Anyway, they're not quite sure who did it. And Stasia comes under suspicion for maybe having tried to steal a diamond ring which has disappeared. The major is under suspicion because, of course, he's got a grudge against the landlord. Then eventually Conrad Veidt produces this ring, which he's picked up off the floor. And then all the suspicion turns on him. And this is the Christ-like moment. He voluntarily takes on the blame, at least temporarily. And then everyone turns on him, and all the hate is directed towards him, and he just suffers it. But then it turns out, the police arrive, and it turns out it was actually somebody else altogether. It was a chap who had a barrel organ in the street that the rich slum landlord had been horrible to, and he tried to steal the diamond ring, and it had, actually what happened is the landlord had a heart attack or something like that. Anyway, so it all ends up. In the end, they're all relieved, that, and the landlord is out of the way, so that problem's gone. And there's this idea that they're all going to start a new life, and everything's happy at the end. And they go to invite the Conrad Veidt character to come and join them, for a little party, a drink, to celebrate, that everything has gone back to normal. And then they find his room's empty. He's gone. He's vanished. And the only person who sees him go is Stasia. There's a very touching little scene at the end. She's the one that says goodbye to him, and she says thank you so much for coming. And that's the end of the film. It sounds simple, but it's actually a remarkably I find quite powerful film. When I watched it again the other day, I was surprised at how much it affected me. I was really quite emotionally affected by it. I find it a very moving film, and of course the kind of religious mystical overtones give it some kind of special atmosphere that you don't get in films like that generally. And I think Jerome K. Jerome obviously had a brilliant idea for this story. So there you are. That's the Passing of the Third Floor Back, starring Conrad Veidt from 1935. And I will put a couple of clips from it just to give the atmosphere, and it is very easily obtainable online. So I hope you might like to go and see it if you haven't seen it before. And if you enjoy the video and are interested by this, please do give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to my channel. Thank you.
What's this? What's this? Where did this come from?
I found it.
Found it. Up to your old tricks again, eh?
It was nearly dead. Nobody wanted it.
I'm not talking about this. I'm talking about my bowl.
Oh, no!
Yes! What right did you to touch it?
It wasn't being used. I only wanted to borrow it.
The same sort of borrowing, I suppose, that got you into the reformatory.
It wasn't a reformatory.
Industrial school, then. Home for good-for-nothings.
You're not going to take it away.
My bowl? I most certainly am.
My flower, my plant! You can't take it away.
So it wants to hear. I will watch you, Miss Rothwell. There you are.
Oh! It's broke.
Get on and answer those bells.
You hateful, hateful. If only there was one decent person in the world. But there isn't. There isn't.
Well, you asked for it. You got it.
Oh, shut up.
You better get round with your hot waters if you don't want some more trouble.
Fat lot I care about them.
Well, you know they're all bursting to get down to the engagement party.
Engagement party. And him old enough to be her father?
Don't forget his champagne.
One bottle between 8. Mean old pig. Fat lot of life Miss Vivian's got. If ever she does marry him.
She'll marry him all right. Can't afford not to with them parents.
Poor Miss Vivian.
Vivian!
Vivian, darling. Oh, I'm just as bad. Worse. What are we all living for? That's what I want to know. What's the good of it?
Miss Kite's perfectly right. You're a useless little slut and you'll go back to the gutter where you came from.
All right. I will. Now.
Stasia! Come back. Where do you think you're going?
The river. Anywhere out of here.
Good evening.
What do you want?
Understand you have rooms to let.
But we haven't.
No.
Will you please come in?
Thank you. No, no, please.
It's Miss Kite. She's running off the stage here.
Oh, Kite? Oh, I don't believe it.
What?
Well, do something! Do something, can't you? Here, let's get...
Come on!
Here, Miss Kite! There you are!
What? Take her out!
Yes. Where's Miss Kite? Where is she? What? Here she is! Hooray!
Come on, swallow it down.
What is it?
Never mind, get it down.
Oh, it'll make me drunk.
Well, better a drunk hero than a dead un, as the poets say.
Oh, don't be silly.
Oh, you can be as modest as you like. That was a real fine bit of work. There's not many would have had the pluck.
That's very nice of you, Mr. Larkin.
And it wasn't only the doing it was the way you did it. No fuss and nonsense. That's the kind I like.
You're making me very embarrassed. Oh, heavens!
Don't do that. You look grand.